We have some on board, which is great. Let's do this. Okay, afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. As an introduction, my name is Sonny Forster. I'm a part of the Delv team and account lead here for New South Wales. I very much appreciate your time this afternoon. Your joining us is very welcoming. So I do thank you for your time this afternoon to be able to share some information with you on our intelligent digital security platform that we have and some of the offerings that are provided by Lookout. And at the same time, we're going to do a bit of a discovery around some BeGIN. So from your interest perspective, whether that be around the security platform or whether that be via BeGIN, I do appreciate your time and thank you for joining us. For the next hour or so, we're going to be diving into 4 BeGINs. So as a part of the introduction, and I guess for housekeeping perspective, we ask that you're prepared for that. I myself here have a few fresh glasses that are ready to go, my condiments as well, and I'm looking forward to diving into some of the BeGIN that the team's been able to provide. So first of all, to the team, thank you for sharing and putting together this platform for us to be able to communicate to our customers. So thank you for that. Also for Bass and Flinders, I think that's a great choice for all you BeGIN aficionados. I think we've made a great choice there. And there's some very different flavors that we're going to experience over the next hour in partnership again by overlaying that with some conversation around digital security. So from a housekeeping perspective, this is where I'm going to pull my dad hat on just at the initial part here. We hope that you're in a safe environment where you actually can enjoy the flavors that we're going to bring you today. We do ask, obviously, the responsibility side of things, that you're in a nice, safe environment and you make the appropriate decisions for yourself. You may have seen a note come out slightly earlier about the level of alcohol that's contained within these beverages. So please be mindful of that. There's no requirement to drink all of it, but if you're that way inclined and you're in a safe environment, then feel free to go for it. So if we've got our condiments in check, we've got our BeGINs ready to go, some tonic here, which is nice and cold, and some other beverages. The next thing I will talk to you is just about the platform here. So we are in a webinar format. You can see down towards the bottom here that we do have a chat function. And throughout the session, either somebody within the Lookout or Delv team will be responding to your questions. If you would like anything asked, of course, to our expert here, Tom Davidson, who'll be joining, please feel free to ask questions. It is absolutely a session of information, which is two-pronged, as I mentioned, around the BeGIN and also on our digital security platform. So please feel free to add comments in there and we'll address those at appropriate times throughout the session here. Now that we've got some housekeeping underway, and I'm sure that you're just looking at the beverages that are sitting off to your side, but just before we jump into that, what I did want to do is just very quickly introduce our intelligent digital security platform that we have here within Delv, acronymed as IDS. And IDS for us, as with everything that we support here within Delv, is human-centered. Our goal is to augment organizations' existing security stack and provide an intelligent protective layer around that biggest vulnerability that we all have within our organizations, which is the people. Our IDS creates a protective layer around your people and the actions that they do every day. It enhances the awareness and the digital security all the way throughout an organization. So Lookout, who we've partnered with here today, is one of those key components of enabling our IDS strategy. And I'm absolutely rapt that they can join us today. Absolutely rapt that they can share some of the insight that they're seeing out there in the market to bring some awareness to such an important and critical aspect of organization security and enlightening us today. There's some points in there which are enlightening is probably the best way to put it. So I'm really happy to be sharing those. So without further ado, let's get into it, guys. We have here the first of the gins that we're going to dig into, which is our soft and smooth. So what I ask is that you crack the bottle, if not already. And the first thing that we're going to do, you may well have seen some tasting notes here. The smooth and soft gin that we have, the description that we have in there is to try it neat. Now, if there's any way to start a webinar with a little bit of alcohol assigned to that, I think is to the neat. So I'm going to be conservative, being the first one. But to taste, the suggestion here is to take a sip, hold it in the mouth for 2 to 3 seconds, and let the gin entice the palate. We want to sort of awaken that, we want to bring it out. Then from there, before we swallow the spirit, we breathe through the nose, keep the mouth closed, so that we get the full effects of that. So to everybody who's been able to join us and everybody who can participate and enjoy this part of the webinar, cheers to you. Now, past going straight for neat, which is always a great way to start. If we feel the requirement on the necessity there, we do also have our Indian tonic. So being, again, responsible and paving the way, I am going to mix, I'm going to enjoy this point in time. So without further ado, hopefully you all now have a gin in hand. You've been able to see the flavor of the spring gin come alive within your mouth. The next thing for us to do is to do some introductions here. So Tom Davison, thank you for joining us. We do really appreciate you being on board. I'm going to hand over to Tom. Tom's going to take you through the spectrum of digital risk. And at the end of that session, I'm going to come back. We'll do an introduction to the second and move forward from there. So Tom, appreciate your support and being with us here today. Over to you.
Thanks, Sonny. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Okay, well, thanks everybody. Good to be here. As you can probably tell from my accent, while I look like I'm in the same bar as Sonny, I'm actually here in the UK, where it's a slightly different time of day. So instead of 4 gins, I'm working my way through 4 coffees. So I'll hopefully get more awake as you start to relax, and we'll meet somewhere halfway through there. But great to be here today. I'm from a company called Lookout. We're a mobile security company. We've been working with Delv for some time now. And what we want to do today is go through a few sections and talk a bit about some of the things that we see as a vendor, some of the risks out there on the mobile side, some of the stats and figures, some of the details around some of the campaigns we've worked on and discovered. And then we'll kind of wrap up with a view on how you can take steps to enhance your security at the end of the day in the mobile space, which is what we're all concerned about. So I'm just going to start with maybe a bit of a recap on the environment. I stay in very close contact with our team down in Australia. You know, we talk at least once, twice a week. So all through the last year, I've been, and you know, we have people globally. So we've been following the whole situation with COVID, and it's been pretty much the same for all of us. Let's be honest, it's been a lousy year, and we're looking forward to getting to the end of it. But one of the trends it has driven is this. I mean, we had this big push for business continuity. Right at the start, we were all locked down from mid-March here, and we were fortunate in that we were already pretty geared up for remote working. But for a lot of companies, it was that sudden thing of how do we keep everyone going? How do we keep the business moving? And sometimes that was a laptop, but in many cases that was, well, what device do you have at hand? Do you have a tablet? Do you have a phone? Let's just get you moving. And so everyone was driving that approach. Of course, it was great from a productivity standpoint. The challenge is that for many companies, that entailed adding a whole load of new devices to their infrastructure. And depending on how that was delivered, that could potentially be expanding the attack surface, but not giving you the visibility that you need. Some companies, as I say, were already pretty geared up, and it was a case of just multiplying what they were doing and scaling out. But for others, I know they had to take measures quite quickly and then kind of think about it as they went on in terms of getting back the level of management and visibility they require. So this is a trend that is definitely accelerated with COVID, but reality is it's a trend that's been going on quite some time. And when you look at what mobile's really done, it's this. I mean, we had this situation legitimately physically under the pandemic where we were, literally all at home outside of the office, but figuratively too, the perimeter's gone, and you'll have heard this talked about for some time. And we now talk much more about the end user being the perimeter, the device being the perimeter, securing the data and so on, because this idea about all of your devices being in a known space, passing through gateways that you can inspect all of your traffic is really gone. And that's probably the biggest game changer. If you kind of remember one thing today, hang on to this one, because this is really the driving force for everything else that is going on. And it's driving a whole lot of new acronyms in the industry. We love to create our new acronyms and things like that. So I'll probably be guilty of dropping a few in today. But fundamentally, it's a fairly basic concept to grasp that we're all working in different ways. Just to try and give you a visual on that when it comes to mobile, this slide I quite like this because it's a basic slide, but it sums up quite a few of the challenges that we see. So obviously deperimeterizing things takes away a lot of those security layers that you would have typically had. But probably the biggest challenge we see, and this definitely accelerated through the pandemic, is this idea of personal and work collapsing. The line between, I mean, here we are drinking gin on a work call, so go figure. But the line between what's work and what's personal has been blurring for some time, and that creates a few different challenges. It creates challenges of, I'd call, kind of shadow IT, where we start to move work conversations into maybe non-work sanctioned tools. And I had this just from a customer recently where he said, we don't want to allow WhatsApp, but our customers want to talk to us on WhatsApp. So we're kind of forced there. So it's starting to be aware of some of the risks around those elements of the platform. But the other point, of course, is these services have done a great job about providing end-to-end encryption and potentially protecting privacy, but that makes it very difficult for you to secure because none of this is going through your security infrastructure. So we believe fundamentally that you need to shift security to the endpoint device, because that's really the only place you can start to figure out what's actually going on. But then the second challenge that we talk to customers a lot about is, well, there's a privacy aspect there. So sure, you want to have something on the device and know what's going on, but you've got to be very careful about what you're spying on and what you're not. And again, I think this is where the pandemic's been quite interesting, because there's been certainly in our workplace, quite a shift in terms of what's normal. People have had kids running in the background, cats jumping on their shoulders, and things that would have been really embarrassing and difficult 12 months ago now start to become the norm. So we're starting to blur everything together. And that's an important one for us as we think about how we secure all this stuff. Just to focus on a bit of the detail about some of the technical things, the technical risks with mobile, because one of the questions we often get is, well, do we actually need to secure mobile? It hasn't Apple and Google covered that one, or we've got an MDM managing it. Isn't that enough? Well, there's quite a lot of things you need to be concerned about. We tend to split it between threats and risks. So we've got threats on the left-hand side, and I'll talk about a couple of examples of these today. But worst case, this is things like nation-state surveillanceware that is implanted on your device. Best case, it might be annoying adware or things that steal data or try and monetize your device. But there's a whole grade, a whole spectrum of threats, if you like, that could impact you. And then on the other side, you've got what we'd call configuration issues, just risks from poor hygiene, just like you would on any other platform. If you're not applying patches, if you're not applying the right level of configuration, you could be exposing yourself. And the things on the left definitely feed on poor practice on the things on the right, as we'll talk about. So a lot of organizations I speak to have a reasonable handle on some of the things on the right. So they probably have some jailbreak and root detection. They probably, if someone downloads the latest iOS jailbreak and tries to deploy it on a work device, which generally doesn't happen very often, they'll probably detect that with an MDM or something else. But when you get to some of the more complex device attacks, that could be different. Same goes for updates. Maybe they have a vision on managed devices, what's going on with operating system versions, but when you get people bringing their own, that can be more confusing, especially with some of the fragmentation in all of the Android devices. So it's like anything, when you add all these things together, it's not black and white. You get a kind of a variance of risk, and then you need to start thinking about, well, what are people doing with this device? what kind of data is on there. And of course, for most of us, it's exactly the same data that we have everywhere else, because mobile devices are just front ends to cloud data stores, and they just become another way of accessing it. So there's some of the areas, and the other interesting point that we're seeing is things starting to converge much more quickly now. So we've been talking about Chromebooks for a while. They've not featured so heavily in the enterprise. They tend to be more in the sort of education sector, from my experience. If you look at the new Apple M1 chip, this ability to firstly get allegedly 20 hours battery life, which is fantastic, but also running iOS apps on a MacBook. That for us, I think, is the start of a real shift. And I've already talked to customers who've talked about that being an important enabler for their business as they move forward. So just to kind of give you an eye chart, don't worry about taking this all in. This will be available later, but this is how we tend to segment things. So if you look at the previous slide, and then you want to get a bit more specific about some of the things themselves, this is kind of how we build it out, and we'll share this often with companies we're working with, just to help them map out where they're covered and where they're not. And you can see on the left that the vertical axis is more this area of configuration right through to overt threats, but then we tend to segment the different vectors: web content, apps, device, and network. And you'll see as I talk a bit more about threats, we tend to monitor these discretely and look at where the major risks lie. And I'm going to talk quite specifically today about web and content, because that's quite an interesting one, quite a prevalent one. But this can be helpful just for you to go back to your business and think, well, of all those risks out there, which ones have we covered? And what I quite like to do is color code this one, just get a pen and color some green, color some red, color some orange. And it very quickly helps you map out where you might need to put more focus, or where you feel comfortable with things that you've already got in place. Just a quick video. I mean, just putting all that together, this is a video one of our researchers took of some work he was doing. And what I like is this, to me, perfectly illustrates the challenge on mobile and why you can't really afford to bury your head in the sand. I'll just click play, and I'll hopefully you can see it okay, and I'll just talk you through it. So what we've basically got is two devices, two iPhones. One of them is vulnerable to a Bluetooth vulnerability, the one on the left, and has some device compromise that is allowing the one on the right to exploit that. Also on the right, we've got a slightly modified, call it Trojanized version of the Authenticator app. So what's happening in the background is effectively we've used Bluetooth to target the one on the left and extract the seed for Authenticator. And you can see now that we've relaunched the version of Authenticator on the right, which is our tweak version. We're managing to perfectly mirror the one-time code. So this is a fairly extreme example. This is one of our researchers playing around. Obviously there's a few things like needing the phones to be within range of each other and stuff like that. Needing to have the right versions of OSs and things like that. So there'd be some work to carry out an attack like this. But it just goes to show, with a few vulnerabilities and a bit of expertise, what's possible. And I like this example too, because most of us are using our phones now as our two-factor, our multi-factor. And we tend to have this idea that, yeah, SMS is okay. We know that's not very safe, but we've got these Authenticator apps now. Just a really good example how even the most secure, supposedly secure element of the device can be attacked. And we've got tons of other videos I'm not going to show you today, unfortunately. We haven't got the time, but things like extracting emails from the file system, and hooking into audio and video. There's loads of cool things you can do, which we can show you in follow-up. Obviously, that's one of our research projects. This is just some of the stuff that's really been happening out there. So these are all things you can go out and Google, and I'm not going to talk through each and every one, so don't worry. But you can see here, the ones in white are what I'd call industry discoveries. Some of the ones highlighted in gray are things that we've specifically discovered and blogged about. So some of those will be on our website. Some of them are out there generally. But you can see there's a whole range of different vulnerabilities and attacks here that relate to the spectrum I talked about. So things like CheckRain, which was an iOS jailbreak that was a problem in the hardware on the device. So you couldn't patch this. If you can physically get someone's iPhone and plug it into your laptop, you can download this tool, and within 5 minutes you can jailbreak their device. And that works on any of the A11 chipsets. Quite a few phishing stories. I'll talk about some of those, but we have WhatsApp as well. So vulnerabilities in WhatsApp. This is another area that's growing, is this idea of if you don't go after the device itself, if you can't hack the OS, you look at targeting the app, because WhatsApp is It's on some sort of billion and a half devices around the world. And if you look in January 2020, there was a story in the press about Jeff Bezos. He was allegedly hacked by the Saudis using surveillanceware that was allegedly distributed via a malicious video that was sent to his WhatsApp account. So go figure, you know, he's richest guy in the world. You would think he'd be able to secure his device, but he was still a high profile target and was subject to an attack. And I'm not saying that you're any of us are as important as him and people are going to come after us in the same way, but these things tend to commoditize and proliferate once they've been tooled up and used against a high profile individual like that. So lots of things here you can dig into after the event. Just a few stats from the Lookout data set. So we have something like 200 million devices have enrolled in our service. We have a consumer offering and an enterprise offering, and that's pretty cool because it gives us this level of visibility. It gives us visibility into devices that have encountered threats. And so this is just a timeline of what we've seen over the last couple of 2-3 years. Now, some of the reason for the increase in the encounter rate will definitely be as we've added more protections into the system. So when we launched our phishing product, which was early 2019, we definitely saw an increase in encounters because we were suddenly seeing things that we weren't seeing before. But for me, the interesting points on this graph are more the fact that there's a pretty steady trend upwards, but also the fact that iOS and Android tend to mirror each other. So there's definitely a concept out there or an understanding with customers that iOS is somehow a bit more bulletproof. Apple have done a good job on us, I would say, in that regard. But in terms of what we see, it's pretty much the same for Android and iOS. What differs tends to be the types of threats that we see. And just breaking it down by stats here, again, you can see that different levels. I mean, Android definitely higher on the app threats, phishing high on both platforms, unpatched OS vulnerabilities and so on. But you can see here, the thing we tend to normally jump to when we think of mobile security tends to be man-in-the-middle attack or root and jailbreak. They're actually the low end of what we see. Tends to be more phishing and that driving some of the other attacks through what we call a kill chain, which I'll talk about. So that's kind of first section over. I think that might already be time for me to hand back to Sonny for you to talk about another gin.
I think you might be right, mate. Thank you for sharing that. There's a couple of things that you're sort of talking about there for me, and especially the that blend of personal and work we're seeing definitely more and more of that, and the utilization of our devices being completely different, and that influence that the end users or the customers have on a mobile strategy for organizations, where they want to use the tools and technologies where they are comfortable with communicating with friends or family, and they want to also implement something as simple or as easy within their own organizations. So we've seen that from the beginning of time when Steve Jobs, I guess, first stood up with the iPhone and everybody had that BlackBerry infrastructure of how we saw the penetration of Apple devices when they first came into that corporate environment. And then that requirement around security became so relevant, so real. And seeing those trends over time is slightly alarming. I guess it's nice to have the concepts there that there's additional products that have awoken some of those awareness points. But absolutely, I think the impetus is now, and the activity is definitely there. We're seeing that in the market more and more. We're seeing more people trying more efforts, and maybe with lockdown, people have all that additional time now to try different ways to expose vulnerabilities in devices, etc. So we do appreciate your insight. Thank you very much for that. You sort of talked about the way that being in lockdown has changed the way that we've done with work. So at this point in time, although I might be in a bar, if you do happen to see a couple of young ones, or if you happen to see Ginger the cat at some stage coming around, then we're all pretty familiar with that nowadays after the last few months, I guess, of having to interact with everybody's family being a part of Zoom calls and etc. It's been very, very interesting. So again, thank you for stage one. We appreciate that. Now, what I will do is just remind everybody that the chat is open. So if you do feel the need to ask any questions on what you've seen there today, please feel free to enter up there. Making special note for Todd jumping in. Thank you very much for that. Absolutely. People can enjoy all sorts of different breakfasts, and gin may well be one of those. So absolutely, I'll probably agree with you that gin is a breakfast drink as well. But we appreciate, Tom, your commitment to the coffee at this point in time whilst we drive through these sessions. So thank you very much for that. So in that case, guys, I'm going to introduce gin number 2. I hope you're ready. I'm not quite there just as yet, but I'll make up for that a little later on when we move on. Gin number 2 is wild and spicy. So if we crack the lid on gin number 2, we take a good sniff of that one. We're actually getting the cardamom, the cassia bark, and also that pepperberry coming out of that one. I'm actually going to go for a bit of ice in this one here, so please join me in that. We have some wild and spicy gin being taken at the moment, and I'm actually going to go for a little cucumber before adding in my Indian tonic. Cheers. So now that we're aligned, and I think that we're ready to tackle the next session, what we might do now is just jump into the next segment, and we're going to really focus on those real world threats, right? And we're going to have a look at how active they are and how wild and spicy that environment is. So please enjoy. Tom, back over to you.
Thanks, Sonny. Enjoy the second gin. There's a fun fact, actually. In my local town, just about a mile up the road, they have a gin bar in one of the hotels. And at one point, they held the world record for the most number of gins. I think he had at that point nearly 200. And then there was another bar opened up in Manchester who ended up with something like 320 or something, took the record off him. He then fought back and he took it back. I think he got to about 385. But it's now moved to London. Someone down there has about 500. So there's a hefty competition, and it looks a bit like the one in the picture behind us. So maybe I'll pop down there later. So I want to sort of change up a bit and talk about some of the real world threats. So I'm going to start with a bit of a story. I don't know if anyone recognizes this person, quite likely not. You might recognize the location. So this is a chap called Ahmed Mansour. He's a human rights lawyer, activist in the UAE, and the story goes back. This is going back about 4 years ago now. Time flies. So about 4 years ago, this chap had an iPhone, and he received a message. This was actually the message he received, or a picture of it. And I'm guessing your Arabic is probably about as good as mine. But roughly translated, that it says something along the lines of, we've got important information about detainees. Click here to find out more. So on the one hand, he was used to getting anonymous tip-offs, things he should maybe look into and follow up. But he was also used to being targeted and was rightly suspicious based on the regime or the location he was operating in. And so instead of clicking the link, he got in touch with a company called Citizen Lab, who they're best known, I suppose, as digital rights activists. They publish quite a lot of stuff online about people being targeted, and they kind of campaign for civil liberties online. They didn't have a lot of mobile expertise. They had some sort of desktop network expertise, but they didn't know much about mobile. So they worked with us on this. And what was interesting was that this was the first time for a long time been rumors about this surveillance where for iOS, but no one had ever caught it in the wild. And this particular individual had been targeted by exactly that. So had he clicked this link, it would have unleashed a whole chain of events that would have basically downloaded surveillanceware to his device, exploiting 3 different vulnerabilities in iOS, which were 0 days. Nobody knew about them at the time, and would have silently installed some surveillanceware on his phone called Pegasus, which you may have heard of now, which is a commercial grade surveillanceware made by a company called NSO Group, who are an Israeli company who create and sell cyber weapons, for want of a better word, to governments for legitimate usage. So they'll sell you a tool as long as you promise to use it in the right way. And there's been many stories since then about the kinds of places that this has been deployed and how it's been used. The reason this one was so interesting was that it was the first time it had been seen in the wild. And it was the first time people really woke up to the fact that vulnerabilities in operating systems were a big part of the mobile problem. So if you click through and get a bit more technical, this is how the chain of events would have unfolded. So there was an exploit that would be deployed against Safari that allowed exploitation of 2 further vulnerabilities in the kernel, which ultimately enabled downloading of unsigned code onto the device out of the sandbox and gain persistence. And what we saw was that this was the first time these vulnerabilities specifically were known about, but it was the first time people had really seen evidence of chaining these things together to embed into an iOS system. Everyone thought previously you really had to go jailbreak the device, your MDM would detect that, you'd then have to have physical access, but this was fully delivered, fully remote, persistent compromise. And once it had done that, it was amazing in terms of what it could do. So like most of the surveillanceWare tools we see today, it had access to pretty much everything on your device, including things like WhatsApp messages, Telegram messages that we tend to trust because we think they're end-to-end encrypted. But like I said before, if you can get in on the device and you can hook the message before it goes through the encryption and out on the wire, you have a copy of that. And you know, I'm a big James Bond fan growing up where I grew up, and you go back and watch some of the old Bond movies and you look at the kind of gadgets and tools that were designed, and they pretty much resemble this, but in a briefcase form or in a pen form. You know, if they could have designed the always connected, always on audio video recorder that tracked your location and, you know, could leak your contacts and address book, that would have been the ideal gadget, the ideal piece of surveillanceWare. So it's not a surprise that, you know, nation states, cyber criminals, targeted threats have been exploiting mobile for quite some time. I think the surprise to most people is that they've not really known about it. It's been happening under the radar, and Pegasus was one of the first really big stories around this, and there's been many more since then. And of course, as I talked about, what starts here, a well-funded nation state level cyber group, starts to proliferate out. So if you're not patching the vulnerabilities, the same proof of concept exploits can be used against your devices, and that's the pattern that we start to see happen. Just to give you a view on how this looked, so this is possibly the least exciting video you'll see, but we took the same code and we ran it in the lab. By the way, there's links. They were one time, and if you tried to click it again, you'd just get redirected to Google. They were putting all sorts of mechanisms to safeguard the spyware and make sure it didn't get into the wrong hands. Luckily, we managed to basically get the device in airplane mode, do the analysis, extract it and so on before it was able to do that self-destruct routine. And then we were able to run the same kind of thing in a lab environment. If you watch the video back, this basically is running the same thing. So not the exact message, but a simulation of what would happen. And here you can see on the vulnerable device, Safari gets opened, Safari crashes, and that is it. That's as exciting as it gets. So if you've ever had an application crash on your PC, and in fact, last time I delivered this, PowerPoint crashed on me, which really freaked me out. But if you've ever had something crash on you in the background, I'm not saying you've just been infected, but that's pretty much what you'd see if one of these exploits was run on a device. So you can imagine for our end user, nothing to see here. The only telltale sign you might see further down the line could be bumps in data usage, extra battery consumption, that kind of thing. And interestingly enough, when you look at the Jeff Bezos compromise, that was one of the reasons they thought he had been breached, that they saw a sudden surge in data usage from his mobile device, like a few gigs of data where normally it was bubbling along at, you know, a few hundred megs or something like that. So that was a telltale sign that a bunch of data had been exfiltrated. But otherwise, not a lot to see. So that is obviously the concern that you need to have. Moving on, I said Pegasus was kind of one of the first and the most famous. It certainly was for us. It was one of the first. You know, we launched our enterprise tool in 2015, and this was one of the first tools that we really went public on. But there's been many more since then. And you know, you can go on our website and have a look at any of these. We tend to blog about most, and there's certain things we don't necessarily blog about. There's certain things maybe we might follow and research for a longer period of time, but typically we want people to learn from what we found, and certainly if there's ever vulnerabilities and things like that, we will be responsibly disclosing them. And it's not just us. You'll see tons of people. One of the main groups that are publishing a lot of the vulnerabilities in iOS is unsurprisingly, it's the Google Project Zero team, So they've spent a lot of time analyzing iOS and some of the challenges, and they've been responsible for disclosing a whole number of vulnerabilities. They found some really interesting ones last year, the Project Zero vulnerabilities, which didn't even require someone to click. They just required someone to browse to a website hosting malicious code, and you get a drive-by download, which is what we're used to seeing on a PC, but we don't tend to assume that that's possible on an iPhone. A lot of these, most of these are nation state, by the way. So a lot of these are countries targeting other countries or cyber criminals. A couple of the more interesting ones, if you were going to dig into them. So Dark Caracal, which was in 2018. This was, I won't say it was being driven by the Lebanese government, but we found evidence on a command and control server where it was a surveillance spread targeting Android, and there'd been lots of testing being done. So there were a series of photos, a series of related IP addresses and usernames and Wi-Fi hotspots that all kind of triangulated and looked like it was basically people testing the thing before or at some point during the development. And one of the interesting things is that a number of these devices all were using the same SSID, which when you located that geographically, it was a government building, the General Directorate of General Security, which is effectively the secret service of the Lebanese government in Beirut. So again, we're not necessarily saying it was driven by them, but it was definitely being operated by someone from that building. Another one, Monocle, which was just last year. This was a Russian piece of surveillance where, but again, very, very strong links to a contractor, a private contractor that's been used by the Russian government many times. So again, another example of perhaps a nation state enabled attack. The reason this stuff is relevant, you might be thinking, well, why is that a concern for me? Well, depending on your organization, it could well be a concern for you. We've definitely seen this year pharmaceuticals start to become, I mean, they're always targeted, but of more interest to other countries than ever before because of the intellectual property around vaccines that are being developed. So that's a change there. But the real point here, I suppose, is that there's a pattern. So the only difference with these versus some of the attacks that target organizations, everyday organizations, is cost. So when you're the first person to locate that vulnerability, that's $1 million endeavor potentially. You've probably got a team of really sophisticated researchers working on that. You're probably just as professional in your approach as you are the companies that are defending against these things. But once that's discovered and once it's out there, it gets replicated, it gets commoditized, it becomes toolkit driven, so that even people like me can start to operate phishing campaigns from home without needing nearly as much expertise as the people that discover this stuff. So that's really the point. And when you look at the mobile malware, it not dissimilar to a lot of what we see on desktops. It follows this idea of a kill chain. So it's really a single event that causes the problem. It's a bunch of things chained together, which will start with some kind of social engineering. So the user is still typically the weak link. It's typically going to start with a phishing message or some interaction. One of the other ones there, ViperRat, involved targeting Israeli soldiers. In the Gaza Strip, they were using it to install surveillance around devices to work out where people were and track locations. And the most basic way, what did they do? They sent images, they set up profiles on social media with pretty good looking girls, and they started conversations with the soldiers and then said, right, let's chat in private, download this application. And guess what most of them did? So it always comes back to human nature, and we're typically the weak link. But once you've done that, it's a case of get something on the device. Now, the expensive way to do that is through exploiting a vulnerability, like we saw in the video there. That's expensive. The better way to do it is just drive the human, get someone to put the app on the device. You've hosted it somewhere, it's not coming via a store, it's not been screened by Apple or Google. And once it's on the device and they've accepted permissions, you're in. And then typically that app won't be the main one. That will be benign, but it'll download second stage code, maybe third stage code, and that's where the activity starts to begin. Once you're on the device, as long as you don't get removed, and quite often you go to great lengths to hide yourself or make it difficult or even impossible for your average user to remove it, you've got that foothold and you're persistent. And And this is getting more creative. I was just reading yesterday. So Mobile Arm, one of the most popular MDM systems, they had a pretty serious vulnerability discovered earlier this year, and then they patched them in June. And of course, a lot of companies aren't that quick to apply patches. And one of the prominent security researcher did some work in September, and he managed to get into Facebook's MDM server. And the vulnerability basically allowed you to do remote code execution. So you could pretty much get privileged access on the MDM server and do what you needed. So this guy managed to break into Facebook. He published a whole blog about that, which highlighted the proof of concept code he'd used. Of course, that then is out there, that then gets used. And if you Google, I saw just yesterday that the NSA, which is the American security agency, it's their top 25 list of vulnerabilities being targeted by Chinese APT groups. This one is number 8, which makes sense because an MDM server has to be available, it has to be connected to the internet. You can probe it, you can find a vulnerable one, you can exploit it. Once you've done that, you can potentially change security settings on every device, you can potentially pivot. So sometimes it's not the obvious thing, sometimes it's more creative ways of approaching to get to the device. But yeah, in all these attacks, definitely social engineering was the thing. Just to highlight the point about unpatched vulnerabilities, these are not immature operating systems now. iPhone 2007 was the launch. I remember that distinctly because I was working for a company at the time where all the execs had them. And I remember being at this dinner where the head of sales was there and a couple of, might have even been the CEO, and they all had their iPhones. And it was the first time I saw that social change where people suddenly stopped talking to each other. And they were all sat there through this dinner, flicking their phones, and we all sat there jealously thinking, I want one of those. What's that? But fast forward, we've all got one of those now, but we're on iOS 14. And what that means is that the code base has become complex. Same for Android 11. So the number of vulnerabilities creeping into these devices is growing. And so it's now not just a case of managing them. You need to really be thinking about patching, not just the OS, but also apps. So, how many apps on your phone, how many updates come out for those apps? Every time one of those updates comes out, they're probably fixing a few security issues in the background. Some of those are major and get public visibility if they're Instagram or WhatsApp. Sometimes it's just a little nip and tuck here and there. But it's happening all the time. There was one for Google Chrome on Android just a couple of weeks ago. So this is definitely something you need to focus on moving forward. Right, so hopefully I've not scared you too much. Back to you, Sunny.
Look, I think rightfully so. I think having somebody such as yourself who gets to see this every day and is right in the heart of mobile security, I think that concern is warranted, and absolutely from the attendees that we're sort of seeing here today, there is interest in that fact and trying to maintain control of devices that sort of sit in there. And something that I've seen recently, and I guess to your point before as well, it's not necessarily the billionaires these days, that it's actually anyone and everyone. And recently we've sort of seen stuff in aged care groups or in organizations, which is slightly alarming, but these people are caregivers, right? And they really want to look after people, and that's their primary function. So the vulnerability at the end there is people trying to do the right thing and wanting to provide care rather than somebody who might have a complete security armory team that sort of sits around them. And that's where I guess we're talking to today about that vulnerability being right at the end point there. I'm not sure that we need to talk about location services always being on and armed forces, Gin's working, armed forces using Strava around activity around those type of things. I'm sure that's it's been in the news enough times where we may not necessarily need to do that. But you're right, we do use those functions every day, whether it be that we're sharing our progress in an Uber, or it is that we're trying to share a location or dropping a pin and keeping amongst our friends. But those location services are on these days, and we're utilizing those every day. I think your insights is really awesome. Like I really enjoying it. So thank you very much for that. We do appreciate it. And out of that, there's been a number of questions that we've sort of seen coming out of the team. So I'm not sure if you can see these in here, but what I might do is just read them out in mind.
Yeah, no, I've got them here. I can see.
We might tackle Stephen's one at the bottom of that list there, if you wouldn't mind. And his question is, in terms of what you've seen in the UK, how do you think UK-based organisations have been handling the move to home or remote working compared to Australia in handling not necessarily enabling users, but securing them?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding the question right, then you're kind of interested to hear what's been happening over here, how much we've been addressing security and enablement at the same time. I mean, how's it been in Australia? I guess you all ended up working at home. Did most companies continue as usual, or was it blind panic? How did it happen?
It still feels that it's here for us. There are restrictions are being loosened, so we do have some people heading back into the office. But we certainly saw that spike, obviously, a few months ago as people were just enabling people, getting them at home, getting them functioning, and turning on a lot of devices. And I think what I saw out of that is not everybody had the right structure in place to enable their people for an incident, whether that be a pandemic, whether that be something else that caused us to change the way that we see work functioning, which was traditionally in the office from 8 till 6 and commuting and doing the rest of that. So there was a large shuffle at the very beginning of activity and people trying to provide connectivity as we were battling school from home, working from home, trying to fight over toilet paper and food supplies and everything we needed to be. And I think a concern for me is that through that explosion, if I can put it that way, of mobility devices, the first point was we just need to get connectivity out to the people, and we need to do that. And the thought process to ensure the security or the posture of organizations was compromised just to facilitate the activity of getting people from home. And it feels that that there's some organizations out there are certainly starting to scramble around that about what we need to do. And I think the challenge for them is through the explosion of devices, lockdown, or reduction in revenue, a lot of businesses are now sort of working through the process of budgets and what that impact was for them in the last 6 months. And my concern is that going forward into our next financial year for Australia, which is in June and July, that then they're trying to recoup rather than putting the right funds into the right areas to ensure that their users are safe, that their environment is working accordingly. So I'm not sure if you've had too much visibility of what's happening down in here in Australia, or if you've had any insight compared to Australia versus the UK, but it'd be great for you to share.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, apart from what we're doing, I wouldn't know too much about Australia, but in the UK, definitely I saw a similar pattern of let's get connected. So bandwidth and initially devices, people just ordering more laptops, more cell phones, things like that. A lot of people were maybe enabled, but not to the degree they needed to be. So some of that also would be, well, let's accelerate some of these cloud services, let's open up access. And it was that balance, wasn't it? Like how much you keep the lights on and keep people moving versus security. And I think for a few weeks, people were almost in flat panic about what was coming. So probably cut a few corners. The organizations I saw cope pretty well. They already had things like VDI, where they could provision desktop images quite easily to whatever, for whatever experience someone had. And they'd already thought through levels of conditional access, so who could access what from which device. So they were already able to say, right, if you're on this laptop, you get this access. If you're on a mobile device, it's more controlled. VPNs, things like that. Excuse me. Authentication tokens was another one. Lots of people using the mobile device for that one. So I think a lot of companies did okay, but the ones that struggled were the ones where they'd probably been ignoring remote working a bit, and they'd been giving people, typical, here's a device, you can get your email on it. And then it was a case of, oh gosh, we've got to explode this quickly. And it was probably a bit chaotic. But I think the challenge now is that you're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. We've all got used to this new way of working. And, we're all looking forward to getting out back in the world and traveling a bit more and going back to the office and things. But most companies will not go back to the office the same way. And a lot of them have seen benefits. They've realized they can actually be more productive in many ways. So I think now is the time to be thinking about not going back to where we were. It's a case of, well, what do I need to do to make this secure and productive in a permanent way for people? And that's where I've seen a lot of the focus over here in the last couple of months.
Yeah, totally agree with you that not only the organization wanting to bring people back in, I think it's more so that we're so accustomed now to being from home, we need to be able to find that balance. So what does that look like from an end user perspective? And what does that look like from a productivity perspective as well, and trying to balance those? And the question that you gave, Stephen, is a great one. So thank you for sharing that. But certainly it seems now, I guess a global view is now really happening, and in many organizations taking best practice and being able to utilize that for their knowledge, because it's not just one individual location that's being impacted by this. It's actually a whole lot more that's coming around. There has never been such a demand at the beginning of the pandemic for mobile broadband devices. I know that the carriers were sitting on a few hundred of those, but the requirement there for thousands and thousands of those to go out just could never have been predicted. So a large part of the conversation that I guess I'm having with customers is this was just one instance. And it allows a lot of the C levels within organizations now to consider the what ifs. And I think, when I'm talking about security and redundancy and those type of things, the what ifs were relevant, but I think they were really pushed to the side because we've never really seen anything like this. But now is the opportunity to bring these real life, realistic conversations now to the table about what is it that we actually do need to do to ensure that our organization is safe. What do we need to do to make sure that our people are enabled to work effectively? And really the first part of the pandemic was us doing that, but it felt like we sort of needed to help ourselves through that. The end point now, which is a really interesting one, once upon a time when we were in the office, once upon a time, it sounds like a lifetime ago, but once upon a time, I think when we were in the office, we were able to collaborate and talk. And if we had an issue with IT, if we thought that there was something interesting going on with a link or whatever else, you'd be able to turn to a colleague or a friend, you'd be able to ask that question. And what we're seeing today is with endpoints being remote and so individual, people are having to make those decisions themselves. They're presented with a phishing exercise, or they're presented with some bait, and they need to be knowledgeable about what's happening or the possibility or the realm of impact to the business, which I think is then, again, putting that impetus on the end user to be able to look after that or to manage that appropriately. A couple more questions, if I can, from you. One from Anonymous, thank you very much for that. If my daughter followed one of the exploit links on the Wi-Fi, could it compromise my corporate devices at home?
Possibly depends on the device. I think if you're talking about a mobile device, I'd be inclined to say no. If you're talking about maybe a desktop or some kind of server with open ports in the more traditional sense, potentially you're on a flat network. One of the things that could affect a mobile device, there were some attacks related to changing DNS on home broadband routers, where often DNS is configured and dished out via DHCP on home networks, and there was some well-known attacks you might have heard of where default passwords or people were able to hack the router because it's typically a cheap device that's not very well secured, and they were able to poison the DNS so that when you're going to a certain website, you're being redirected to the attacker's website, and that's not happening on your device, it's happening on the DNS that's being given out. So that's one thing to be aware of. Typically with mobile, you don't kind of get people port scanning you and probing you in the way that we might have thought of things spreading laterally on a network. They're more likely to target you as a user and spread through a service that you're using on the device. So I'd be more worried about if you start getting weird Instagram or WhatsApp messages from your daughter's account that you don't recognize. Be careful about what you click on, because that's the more likely way they're going to try and compromise you.
There are too many. I don't know, but the conversation of the youngsters these days, like I'm showing my age, the conversation of the youngsters is something that I don't understand in the first place. So, I guess seeing unusual messages just probably feeds into that. Totally legit.
To be fair, if I tried to follow my kids on Instagram, they'd block me. So
We're impressed that you have an Instagram account. Don't worry about it. That's okay. We're with you. Next question for you. The targeting, is it generally targeted at specific people, or is it random? What are you seeing there?
Both, to be fair. Yeah, if you look at, there's a sliding scale on the attack spectrum from the most well-funded nation-state attackers, which are probably governments. You know, if you follow any of the APT stories of the Chinese groups that are pretty much plainclothes government employees working out of plain buildings, very well funded, you'll see that all over the world, and there'll be highly targeted attacks. You'll also see cyber criminals getting in on the action, where it won't be targeted, it'll be about harvesting kind of far and wide, much more random. And then in between, you'll get targeted attacks that are probably less sophisticated than the nation state type stuff, but using the same techniques that have been passed down. So yeah, I think everything in between, how much you're targeted, is going to depend on the asset value at the end of the day. There'll always be low-hanging fruit. If you leave a door open, people will come in and have a look. If you really secure something and it's really important, people will go after it if it's really important to them. And you know, it's all about relative security and so on. So with mobile, it's a bit of everything. But of course, with the mobile device, it's always connected. It's always on, and you're connected to many services that are not passing through any kind of corporate inspection. So one of the dangers is that even if it's random, you could somehow compromise something that could lead to something else. You know, you might lose, you know, the most basic thing is losing a credential that you use on the personal side, and you've reused that credential somewhere else. I mean, most of us, I'd hope, wouldn't do that, but that's, you see every year that, you know, the most common passwords that get leaked, and you know, and we see that. We have a service in our consumer app called Breach Report, where you can stick your email in and it does dark web monitoring to see if you've been breached, if that email address has been used anywhere else. And it's interesting. You know, I had an account on, I think, Dropbox, or one of the services that was hacked about 7 or 8 years ago, and you can see that was used in lots of other places. I mean, I changed the password, but they'll do that. They'll take it and try it all, you know, elsewhere to see what they can get. So that's where the random attack could become more dangerous.
And is there a way that, just leading on to the next question, thank you for that, is there a way to see if the team has been, someone in the team has been exploited, or if they have any current active exploits?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that is interestingly the direction this is starting to take. So protection is definitely the first thing you want. So you want to obviously try and stop yourself being breached, and that, you know, involves having the right security tools there in the first place. But there's also a focus now on detection and response. So the idea that you need that visibility as well. So it's not just about, well, it is about protecting, but in the worst case scenario that something gets through, either because you didn't have the right protection, or, and this is a game of cat and mouse, something new was discovered that no one had conceived before, and you did get breached. You want monitoring in place to be able to detect unusual activity. Now that could be on the network because someone takes your credential and starts logging in and moving laterally. Could be on device. It could even be down to things like new apps being installed, or changes in activity in the endpoint device. So we're starting to see more focus on that on mobile as well, because people suddenly realize actually a lot of work's being done on mobile. A lot of my team do maybe half their day on a mobile device, and maybe I don't have the same security footprint there that I do elsewhere, or maybe I don't have the same level of tooling to give me insights that I might have on a Windows laptop. So people are starting to think along those lines now. How can I get more visibility and pull that into the mainstream tools that I've already got?
Awesome. Great advice. Now, if we can, Tom, we might just jump into the third gin on the list, if that's okay by you. I'll just take a couple of moments.
Sure.
Because we're sort of seeing that the monsoon, gin number 3, is certainly out there, and we certainly see a big wave. So those who are playing along at home, I am now moving on to monsoon gin. If I can get you to get a fresh glass, of course, being the polite and courteous people that we are with fresh glass, we're going to enjoy this one. So for monsoon, we've got the ginger ginseng lemongrass. Wow, that's really great. And we'll keep that one neat for a little while. And I am on a stool, so if I happen to perch off to the side, then everybody will be fully aware of why. So with that, and with our monsoon gin in hand, and everybody's here, let's take a little bit of a deeper dive, if we can, to the next segment and have a look at phishing.
Sure. Thanks, Sonny. I'm getting quite jealous now of the gins. I think I'm waking up.
The coffee envy is wearing off, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Time for the Irish coffee. Right, so let's talk about phishing then. So just a few examples here. I mean, we all get phishing messages all the time, and these are some of the more obvious types of things we see. I guess the first thing on this slide to be aware of is it's not email and it's not just SMS. So when you think of phishing, people go, oh, it's smishing, that's SMS phishing, or it's email. On a mobile device, there was a stat that came out. It wasn't one of ours, actually. It was another vendor came out with a stat that they said something like 85% of phishing on mobile doesn't come through email. And actually that tends to line up with what we see, which is an interesting point, because if you ask most companies where they're performing phishing protection, it's going to be on email. And so just because you've got that on a mobile device and you've got coverage there, that would be one thing to highlight. Second thing, as you can see here, this mix of work and personal. You're much more likely to respond to a message that's maybe not coming through a work channel or is not directly related to work. And we saw that. I'd mentioned the Israeli soldiers one, but we've seen that time and again where people craft phishing messages around topics that people are interested in or concerned about. So these are just some of the kinds of things you'll have coming through. Of course, mobile is a sort of a riper hunting ground in many ways because of the form factor of the devices and the way we interact with them. So if you think about when you're on a work laptop, if you get an email message, firstly, you're probably expecting phishing to come through email. Secondly, you probably won't get that many now because you've got some security in place. But thirdly, if you do get a message come in, you're probably already well trained to hover over links and look for the real URL, look for what's happening. You're not going to do that on a mobile device. You don't have that ability. You've also got the 3D touch where things start to preload, and you also get this a lot in apps now. So if you're in Facebook or Slack or WhatsApp, they all have their own web views where things are getting preloaded and prefetched and stuff like that. So that ability to sanitize a link is harder. Same thing with the screen real estate. So quite often now, the URL doesn't even appear. It pops off the top of the screen. If it does appear, it may be truncated like this, so you might not have that ability to see it. And hackers are pretty clever about creating these long subdomains where you might have fairly legitimate looking URL .something-else.com a load of other characters whatever the final top level domain is. So the real domain, your real URL's huge, but the bit you see on the screen is fairly truncated. A lot of them using SSL now. A lot of them are spinning up TLS certificates to secure phishing sites. So having the padlock there is no longer really a thing you can necessarily trust. So this whole idea about detecting what's malicious or not is challenging in the first place. If you do go to a phishing page, it's getting hard to tell one from the other, as you can see here. So we've got an example here of a couple of Google pages, and you'll see people creating phishing pages that are targeting mobile devices specifically. And what I mean by that is, were you to take some of these links and open them on a desktop, it wouldn't look right. The graphics would be all over the place. The form factor would be wrong. But they're using the user agents and things like that to recognize you're coming from mobile and serve you a page that looks very convincing. Quick quiz for you. I don't think you can really answer, so I'll have to just run with it. I don't know, Sonny, maybe I can test you on this. Put you on the spot. Which one's real, do you think? Which one's fake?
Oh Lord, couldn't really tell.
You have my slide deck as well. You should know this. Right, I'll help you out here. So yeah, the one on the right is fake. Had you got the URL in there, it would have definitely been easier. But for the rest of it, you can see we're missing a G here. We've got a slightly different color here. I'm not even sure what the difference is with this one. But yeah, very, very convincing on that one. Another one here. This is perhaps easier. I say that. Sonny, do you know which one it is?
We're going to play the odds and say the other side, but you know.
Oh, you'd be right. Yeah, so basically the one on the left is the real one, and you might be more familiar with that, as we tend to use Microsoft a bit more. But again, very convincing, and this is the kind of thing you'll get where you'll get the sort of URL crafted. And there's all sorts of phishing kits out there that come pre-packaged with all the common login pages, so you don't need to go off and create your own. You can download a toolkit and you can say, right, today I'm Microsoft, or even things like Starbucks or whatever the coffee shop you're in happens to be, if you wanted to run that attack locally over your own sort of Wi-Fi access point or something like that. So there's they can be quite fun to play around with if you've got any colleagues you wanna trick. But on a more serious note, this is the sort of thing that you might come across, and I suppose this is a good example of why multi-factor is important, because username and password can be quite easily stolen. But as we've seen already, getting a second factor, if it's sent via an SMS or an email or even generated by a token, is not impossible for our attackers to get hold of. The other thing that maybe is a consideration is when you look at the Google one, you know, we use Google Workspace here at Lookout. Many people use Microsoft OneDrive, and these are now cloud services that they're great in that they offer a consumer-like service to enterprise users, so we have a nice experience. But the point is they're consumer and enterprise services at the same time, and so you may end up being fooled because you use this thing for work as well as personal and so on. So definitely a concern. Little video here. So we have a phishing capability in our product, and fortuitously for me, I actually did receive a genuine WhatsApp phishing message about a month or two after we launched this product. So I took the chance to just record a little video just to give you an idea. But I promise you that the link in here is 100% genuine. This was the message I received, which I've sent back to myself here for the purposes of just recording the video. But this was the exact message I got. And funnily enough, a bunch of colleagues in Europe got a very similar message, but with different URLs related to things that were of interest to the country they were in. So apparently the British like Lego. We have Legoland. I did Google, you have one in Melbourne, but it didn't look quite as impressive as a bit sort of lower scale. I mean, Legoland's a huge theme park thing here, and all the kids spend way too much time there. Luckily mine are too old, but it's expensive, so the chance for a free pass is not to be sniffed at. Now click the link and you can see that we've blocked it here. The interesting part comes when I look at how the link looks. So you can see it briefly in the browser there, but when you see it broken out in our phishing tool, you see it actually looks very different. And compared to that one there, sorry, that was a bit quick, but what they're doing is using some URL encoding. I'm now just going to switch off the phishing protection so we can actually click the link and go through to it. If I just jump back, yeah, here we go. You maybe there can spot the difference. If you look here, it looks completely legit. The clue is when you actually see it in the web browser, there's a little dot under the A there, if you can see that, depending on how the gin's going. But that dot is a special character. It's not an A, and they're using Unicode. They're using encoding to effectively make that appear as close to legitimate as possible. And if you click through, this was the real page that was there, and there was this sort of ticker of tickets that was going down as you watched it to drive some urgency. There was some reviews from users that had apparently already got their tickets. So had I gone ahead, it was going to just take some information from me. It was going to grab my email address, probably some personal info that they could potentially monetize elsewhere. So when we talk about, is it targeted, is it random? Completely random, something like that. Many of my colleagues got a similar message. The only difference was instead of Legoland, they got whatever their local store or theme park or attraction was. But that was a campaign. There was one that happened just a couple of weeks ago. There was a Trojan, a banking Trojan that was being widely deployed in Japan and parts of Asia Pacific. And it suddenly pivoted to the US. And over a weekend, hundreds of thousands of people in the US, including quite a lot of my colleagues, got these messages saying you've had a parcel delivery, click here to reschedule it. Common stuff. Again, a completely random attack, but what it was trying to do was sideload an app on your device that could act as a mobile banking Trojan. So this is the kind of thing people try and monetize. We talked a bit about the pandemic. Not surprisingly, we saw quite a shift towards phishing and app threats related to COVID, because we were all stressing out, right? We were all keen to get more information on what was going on. So some of it would be things like click here to find the latest. You know, the more interesting ones, people being told to isolate. Great if you want a day off work, but you think about the implications here to be able to potentially shut down a business if you tell everyone they've got to stay at home and isolate and so on. We also saw there was a commercial spyware that got distributed in a COVID app, not one of the track and trace apps, one of the ones that was giving you heat maps. And early on, if you remember, there were certain apps that would tell you how many cases were going on and things like that. So there was one of those apps that was used to package up surveillanceware. And as is common, it wasn't the only app. There were about 30 different apps they were using. Some were photo apps, some were, I don't know, desktop wallpapers, all the kinds of apps you get. But they thought, okay, we'll pivot and use a COVID-related one to drive some more hits. So that's what they do. So this ability to kind of quickly pivot into any topic of interest is a common one. But it's not just random. And here's a couple of examples, not the clearest of graphics, but these are two different campaigns that we discovered about 12 months ago, pre-pandemic this was, but targeting two of the biggest carriers in the US. But what was interesting is these were actually targeting their employees, not their end users. So we've got AT&T and we've got Verizon on the right-hand side. The Verizon one, I think, is particularly interesting because this was their NetScaler login. So this was pretty much the gateway to a lot of their applications for their employees. And you can see here the URL, it's secured with TLS, is pretty much identical. The one on the right actually is the fake one. The one on the left is the legitimate one, but impossible to distinguish one from the other. And the other thing you can't really see there, but we're grabbing username, we're grabbing password, but we're also grabbing the second factor, we're grabbing the passcode here as well. So again, a highly effective targeted attack against their employees. So when I talk about mobile phishing, yeah, there's a whole load of things you wouldn't want to click on because, you know, they might steal some credentials, personal stuff, might install some annoying adware, but this is the sort of thing you actually would be more concerned about in your business. Someone really targeting your specific employee group and taking them where they shouldn't be going. Just a bit of statistics on likelihood. You know, one of the questions we often get is, well, how likely am I to hit this? We showed you the stats early on about how prevalent phishing is compared to everything else. And it's definitely the highest vector on mobile because it's the easiest one to start with. And it also is the gateway to most of the other attacks. This is just a stat comparing overall percentage of corporate email that Microsoft considered to be malicious versus how many of users on our service hit a phishing link in Q1 of this year. So it's I guess it's not a like for like comparison. They're two slightly different measurements we're talking about. But I suppose the point here is that lots of people hit phishing links on mobile. As I said before, most of the time that's not through email. And then of that, we tend to see, I don't know if I've got another stat here, but we tend to see, yeah, I do, kind of a split between iOS and Android that's fairly similar. So this idea about, you know, one platform being safer than the other is largely not true. The only place we do see quite a significant difference in stats, which I guess should be comforting, is on people running our personal product versus people running our enterprise product. So it would seem that on an enterprise device or a device secured by an enterprise, they're a little bit more careful. But the weird one for me at the bottom is that it seems to make not much difference whether they have MDM or not. In fact, it tends to be worse when they have MDM. The only thing I can conclude is maybe people feel they're protected in some way, or I don't know. But again, an MDM is generally not, well, isn't providing any phishing protection, so that's kind of a consideration. This is just for you guys, kind of a view on what we see in your region. That's a global number I just put out there. So we have this is on our website. You can go to lookout.com and find this map. It's an interactive map, so you can go and have a look at the encounter rates for different parts of the world and see where the hotspots are. You can look at types of phishing, whether it's credential theft or malware delivery and platforms and so on. So you can go and have an explore. Obviously, our sample rates vary. So where you've got grey countries, that's basically because we don't have enough data for it to be statistically relevant. But certainly in the bigger areas of the world, we've got more devices running there, so we get more of a view on what's happening. And it's not the best news. I don't be negative, but it's definitely going on. But yeah, feel free to have a look at that. I think we also break this out into verticals as well, or certainly some of the threats. So you can look at, if you're in, I don't know, healthcare or finance, whatever it might be, what's relevant to your sector. So yeah, mobile phishing, definitely a thing, definitely something to be aware of. Yeah, back to you, Sonny.
I think that the concern, there's a few things there for me. I mean, the numbers are a little concerning, and also too that our Lego land is not as great as yours. I think they're two things that will probably should be a concern and take
That was a big assumption, actually. I've never been to your one. It could be fantastic. That was just Google.
We love Lego. Everybody loves Lego, right? So,
right.
So thank you for that. Now, I think it's also a really, really good time just to introduce. You sort of mentioned there the difference between the enterprise and the work, the personal aspect as well. So as a part of what we're doing here today, there is an opportunity for people to test that personal view within Lookout as well. So if anybody's out there is interested in, I guess, seeing the capability of what Lookout is and the insights that you can get, there's an opportunity there for us to use some of the personal side as a bit of a test, a bit of a hands-on and a bit of a viewpoint of that. So if that's just something of interest in you, then please reach out to your local Delvian just to investigate that a bit further, because we do have the support on Lookout on that. Now, Tom, just whilst you're probably trying to regather yourself too, there's a really great question sitting over there from John. So I might just give you a bit of a chance just to have a quick look over that. And in the meantime, there's a few other things for me. I think that the relevance of phishing is for everybody in this session, right? Like we're seeing that more and more, and we're seeing that elevate itself in every one of our inboxes, emails, and on our devices that currently sit in there. So it is something that's real. And you're right. I mean, I think there is a whole lot of concern that goes into that from even a family perspective, an enterprise perspective. Your point, I guess, around the MDM solutions and having that, I think for me, it may well just be the industrial side. Like a lot of people have that MDM footprint that's currently in there. So maybe it's those larger organizations that they feel that they should be trying to get to for that, for the cash or the coin that's available at the other end of that. So they're using those high profile businesses to try and attack or get to those type of people that's from there. And once you just have a quick look over that, I think this is an opportunity for me perhaps to introduce the fourth GIN and the last that's on our list, and something that I've actually been really, really looking forward to getting into, which is the Sir Eyes, as pronunciation goes, around this beautiful pink GIN that's been sitting here. And the color comes from the natural cherries and that they've put into this GIN. And this is the time for those who are playing along at home. You've also been provided the elderflower tonic. Now, the recommendation is to utilize this one with that GIN. So just as I take the top off that one and get myself prepared, as everybody else does at home. Tom, if perhaps you could have a look at John's question there for me, and if you could answer, I'll prepare myself over here.
Yeah, so the question, I'll read it out. How does WebRTC impact either positively or negatively? WebRTC is embedded much more often and security is improved with no plugins required. So WebRTC is, let me try and work out the acronym here if I can read it for you. Real-time communication. So this is, I guess, aimed to allow more secure browser-based, device-based communication, audio, video, without necessarily needing native apps quite so much, provide a bit more inherent security. Like anything, any extra security is going to help, but I suppose the point I would come back to, I guess the first point is, have I seen any kind of exploits of this or any issues specifically with WebRTC? No, but then I haven't necessarily looked deeply into it. Something our researchers might be able to comment on. My gut feel with this, though, would be it would come down to, again, platform vulnerabilities or browser-based vulnerabilities. So if this is shifting more to a browser-based communication flow, then I suppose the interest for the attacker would be to exploit the browser itself. We saw Chrome about 2 weeks ago had some critical vulnerabilities that Google patched. Similar one for Firefox actually last week on Android. And some of the challenges, especially with the Chrome one, I saw with our customers, is that the patches weren't necessarily available because the way things roll out through Android, sometimes you get the availability very quickly, same day. Sometimes it takes a while for that to be made available to your device, or sometimes it may never be made available. So a bit of a fluffy answer in that I don't have real evidence of this sort of changing things one way or the other, but my view would be if it secures things, it's a bit like if you look at WhatsApp as an example that provides decent end-to-end encryption, the way to go about that is not to try and attack the encryption, it's to try and get the message before it's encrypted by attacking the app itself. So that would be my guess as to how someone would target that.
Appreciate that, thank you. And I think as we're all diving into this fourth GIN, I think the path that we've been given on those layers that we've been able to have on the GIN tasting is fantastic, starting with the nice, soft and smooth, and moving into the wild and spicy, and finishing off here, sorry Tom, finishing off here with the balance of the flavors of the cherry and also too with that elderflower is absolutely fantastic. And as we're moving around into now afternoon time here in beautiful New South Wales, the sun being out, this is absolutely a great time for me to hand over to you once again and see your knowledge on the next topic. So yeah, cheers to you.
Perfect, thank you. Do you know, I'm going to have to chase down your gins and see if I can find them here, because I'm intrigued now that they sound great.
We will absolutely send you some.
So this is the last section. I'll keep this briefer just because I know it's getting to the end of the day. You'd probably rather be drinking gin than listening to me talk about mobile security now. But we just want to wrap it up by looking at secure remote working, zero trust, how you can kind of pull this together. We've talked a lot about some of the issues. We've talked about the pandemic and some of the changes. So this will just focus a bit on some of the best practice and what you can start to explore. You know, pretty obviously, this is the situation we're in. As I said at the beginning, I don't see this going back. I don't see us going back to a point where mobile's peripheral. I see mobile becoming really central, but I also see this steady convergence of desktops and mobile devices, so it just will become more about form factor. You'll see the same OS probably running on all devices at some point soon, and it will be what we call a modern OS. And by modern OS, I don't just mean something released in the last few years. I mean something that will probably have a fully curated app store, will probably not allow security tools to run in the kernel like we were used to with the older OS X, Mac OS versions and Windows. And it will probably be used with sort of mix of personal and work and so on, and using stuff largely from the cloud. So that's kind of the new world. The challenge is we've talked about a lot of these during this presentation, so I don't need to labor these, but for most people, they still don't actually have any security on mobile. They tend to have device management, MDM, which was never really meant to be security. It included this root and jailbreak detection typically, because and people assume that was security, but things like phishing protection, things like monitoring of app vulnerabilities, network security that the device is connected to, those are not things that an MDM does. So an MDM is great for securing the settings of the device, making sure you've got passcodes configured, making sure that risky configurations are not enabled. And we are seeing a bit of a merge. So I don't want to generalize, because there are some MDMs that provide more security than others. And we are starting to see a convergence of management and security, also unified endpoint security, where what you got on a desktop and a mobile might start to converge. But it does mean that for a lot of companies, they haven't got the same level of security on a mobile device. Also, top right, this idea about hunting for threats and doing forensics. We had the question about how do I detect if I've been breached? That's something I haven't seen very few organizations with. It's a maturity level that's people normally are not at that point, maybe not on their desktops either yet, to be fair. Other challenges with mobile, we're reliant on the end user to drive updates quite often. And so you have to work with the end user. It's not about trying to block everything. It's about trying to guide them, educate them, allow them to make informed decisions, and and try and provide essentially a zero trust experience, so that rather than trying to control everything, you allow them a certain level of freedom, but you control how they access corporate data. And you say, well, you can do your work on this device if the device is safe, but if we see a threat, then we're going to restrict you until you clean that up. We're not going to stop you installing apps. We're not going to stop you accessing websites that you need to access. We're just going to say, if they introduce a threat, we need to start having visibility and control of that. And then the last bit would be apps. So things like what apps can do. I talked before about WhatsApp, whether you allow it or not, but whether you do allow it, you really need to understand not just what permissions it asks the end user, but what can it actually do? What countries does it connect to? Where does data go? What types of things can it read on the device, and so on. So that's, I guess, another level of visibility down compared to what most people have right now. Talk about maturity model. We tend to map it out a bit like this. I would say just about every organization is at least at step one. I don't know anyone that doesn't have at least some kind of management and control of a mobile device. Many are moving to this stage two, where they have some level of security on there, some kind of at least an idea of a security strategy. And that will often involve dealing with BYOD or unmanaged devices. So this idea of providing a fully locked down corporate device, an iPhone in supervised mode or something like that. I don't see many people doing that. Or if they do that, they do it typically for a subset of users, and then they have more flexible usage models for other people in the business. More people moving towards this step three. I guess the difference between 2 and 3 for me would be starting to implement some zero trust, some conditional access. So you start to integrate with other systems, which could be O365. It could be with app protection policies from Microsoft. It could be Google Workspace, and looking at the identity and saying, if this person's coming in and they're coming in from this device, we need to ensure that the device is safe before they come in. So it brings the assessment of a mobile device into that decision-making process. And also on the mobile side, it's looking at phishing. It's adding that extra layer of security. Where things are moving to, and cutting edge, I mean, I'd say this is probably the next 2 to 3 years, it is starting to bring endpoint detection and response to a mobile device. So there's plenty of VDR or XDR, people are calling it now, vendors out there who will talk about giving you detection and response capability across network, services, cloud, endpoints. But when you look into it, most of them have very few capabilities on mobile, because it's a different way of doing things. You're not running in the kernel like on Windows, able to scrutinize the registry and all of the files and things like that. On the mobile, you're typically running as an app, and so it becomes more about big data. It becomes about collecting data, analyzing it in the cloud, analyzing apps off the device, and being able to have a posture. And that takes time. You can't just turn that on overnight. You have to be collecting data for a period of time and doing that analysis. Some of the points here on the left, this different approach. I've talked a bit about the balance of privacy. Absolutely, you have to consider that. At the first level, that's going to be policies, just saying what people can and can't do and what you will and won't look at. But it also extends to the vendors you use. You've got to scrutinize their privacy. What facets of your configuration of your data are they analyzing to provide security? What's okay, what's not okay? This idea of real-time detection on a mobile device. So you don't just want to wait for something to update the next time a device checks in with the MDM. You want to be able to have that sort of real ongoing view. And the ideal, the real mature model would be able to apply that security, whether it's someone's personal device or a company-owned device, which again takes a different approach, because how invasive you can be and how restrictive you can be on a personal device is going to be very different. So it's about being able to provide the right level of security, but without overstepping that line of what you can do as a business. So just some food for thought. We're not going to talk much about what we do today, hopefully not, but we can follow up on that. That's for another day, but just an insight into what we do as a company in terms of data. So with mobile, it's definitely about data. You have to collect this stuff and analyze it and draw conclusions from that. And we've been doing this for a long time. So we pile all this stuff into what we call our security graph. But again, this is not dissimilar to what desktop endpoint solutions are doing now. But I think we all understand it's not just about what goes on the device. It's what you can learn from all the different areas of the network and the infrastructure, and you pull that stuff together and you start to draw conclusions. So for us, that's looking at telemetry of devices to see if they've been compromised. So going back to the Pegasus example, you might not know what those attacks are the first time you see them, but you can see there's something not right with that device based on the telemetry that we get back from it. Same with apps themselves. Every time a new app gets released, it's a new version and new capabilities get introduced. So all of that analysis goes in there as well. As I say, probably for another day to dive into that and how we do things, but all of that should hopefully allow you to get to this zero trust point of view, which is you have something on the device, you have a big data pool that interacts with that to ensure that the device is healthy. And from that point on, it should be a kind of fit and forget. You then just deploy this conditional access layer. So you don't need to analyze all the ins and outs of the device. You just need a signal about whether it's good or bad. And if things are good, you allow people through and let them get on with their jobs. If there's an issue, you flag that to the admin, you block them from the access, and you flag that to the end user. And the majority of times users will self-remediate and they'll clean up the issue because they're not trying to circumvent security. They're not trying to get into trouble. They've probably just clicked on something they shouldn't have done, or maybe downloaded an app that isn't exactly what it purports to be on the outside. So it's this idea of sort of continuous conditional access or zero trust. And as I say, there's tons of acronyms out there on this. The analysts are having a field day on defining this, but this is really where it's moving to, is this idea about everything's out there in the world. We don't trust anything, so we just protect our data and control the entry point to access that data through this. If you deploy with endpoint protection alongside an MDM, this is pretty much how it works. So you have a separate app that would be the mobile endpoint security. You typically drive that through an endpoint management solution or an MDM. And then there's a back-end connection between the two. So the idea is that you have an ongoing dialogue between the agent on the device and the security cloud, the security graph. And then if something's found, that alerts the UEM system in the back end, and you can take remediation. And this is really the basis of any kind of conditional access. The interaction happens between the lookout security graph and whatever system you're integrated in, and then there's this sort of ongoing real-time dialogue between the two. So if a threat's found, you can restrict access. If a threat's remediated, you can open up again. So the concept's not particularly complex. It's just about making sure it fits in with your deployment model, and the user experience is trusted and known, and everything else. So that's definitely something for another day, and how we can help. But hopefully that's been useful to you. It's been really great to get so much of your time, and hopefully you've enjoyed the gins while I've been talking. Thank you.
Absolutely. I have enjoyed the gin, but also enjoyed your knowledge. So we really appreciate you sharing that with us. It's a very relevant topic, and I believe with the shift in the way that we're currently doing work and that change that we've gone through, it's really, really great time. I think it's a really good opportunity for me just to raise this point in here as well, whereby there's an opportunity for us to take the conversation around endpoint security to the next level, and there's an opportunity for us to be able to do that. That's in your pack, so please take advantage of that, plus the additional support that we've had out of Lookout. Thank you very much for that. There is one final question in here, Tom, and just perhaps if we can just jump onto that very, very quickly, wrap that up, and then sort of final farewells. How do you approach threat hunting, and do you have an EDR solution available for mobile?
Yeah, actually, we do. We have one coming to market very shortly. So what we realized is that the slide I chucked up a minute ago, we have a ton of data, and we've typically been using that for our own research. So we have an internal thing called the research console that our team uses. So when they're hunting for things, they're mining that data. So an example might be if they see an app on a device, especially if you only see that on one or two devices, that becomes interesting. They'll typically have a copy of the app binary. They might then start looking at things like what websites does it connect to, what domains does it open up. They might then plug that into the system and look at other things that are related. They might look at who signed the code, whether we've seen any other malware signed by that. A lot of that's automated, but when they're doing the threat hunting, they certainly have these tools. So what we've figured is that if we have that, why don't we start making that available? So that's definitely what we're going to be doing early next year. So it becomes a kind of a platform, a modular approach. You have endpoint security, you have various levels of, depending on what you get into, device vulnerability management, app risk and compliance management, and so on. But then the next stage would be EDR. That's definitely the sort of next level of maturity, and that will allow you to maybe take data you've got from other systems and search what we have on that. It will allow you to mine telemetry from your devices and then export that as well. So if you want to integrate that into other dashboards or tool sets, that will be available. So yeah, we're looking forward to that. That's going to be, I think there's some stuff on the website already. You can go and have a look at how that's going to work, and that will be coming to market early next year.
Fantastic. Very relevant question from the team. So again, appreciate that. So in closing, guys, if I can just take an opportunity, first of all, Tom, again, your knowledge, having you here has been absolutely fantastic. It's also allowed me to sit here and enjoy the gym, which has been absolutely wonderful. So double thank you on that one, even though you slagged off our Legoland.
I must come and visit. I'm looking forward to being able to come and visit again. It's been too long. But...
We'd love to have you. For the attendees who joined in, thank you very much for your time and joining in with us. I'm absolutely rapt that Delv's given me the opportunity to host this for you. Hopefully it says a lot about not only being able to hold this conversation flowing, but also being able to do that after a couple of gins under the belt. So perhaps, they know me quite well and my capability to be able to do that. So thank you guys for that. For the team that put it together, I really appreciate you coordinating the exercise and putting this all together. Your efforts are greatly appreciated. So from everybody here at the Delv team and the partnership with Lookout that we've been able to drive and deliver here today, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll talk to you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks.